And it was all part of the expansion. It was much bigger than just the podcast. It caused me to, after all these years as a coach, to say, well, what do I want now? What if I'm not done? What if I'm not on cruise control? What if I'm just getting started 20 years in? Holy cow. And the funny thing is I didn't tell anybody for months that I was working on a podcast. I didn't tell my husband. I didn't tell my son. This is The Growth Moment with your coach, Amy Kay. Inspiration, ideas, and incredible insights for you to be more and do more. Get ready to grow today. This is a different episode. Instead of me coaching someone or doing one of my tools, we're going to go behind the scenes and behind the mic, and I'm handing things over to my oldest relationship, my partner in crime in many ways, my muse, my sounding board, my growth partner, which is my sister, Jan. And Jan is my older sister by 4.5 years, but we always trade back and forth of who feels like the older sister. So Jan is going to interview me today, give me a chance to pause and breathe and reflect on this whole odyssey that has been a giant growth moment for me of starting this podcast and a lot of other things. So without further ado, Jan, I'm handing the mic over to you and I'm in your hands.
Well, you've been in my hands for a lot of years, my sister. I'm really excited about pulling back the curtain. And I mean, I always know you to be so courageous in looking at yourself, and to put that out for your listeners is just another step in your kind of brave and courageous and vulnerable growth.
All right. And I hereby promise that I'm going to show up as Amy and not just Amy Kay, the coach. And yeah, give that window into what it takes for me to show up in the world as my sometimes biggest self. So I promise I'll answer anything you have and be as honest and authentic as possible.
That's awesome. Thank you. Well, I think I'm going to start with a really broad question. If you wouldn't mind, just close your eyes for a moment and just take a breath to get here. And then let my questions land and see what comes up. So, how has the podcast been your growth moment?
Really loved and needed that breath to come in. I'm usually running 100 miles an hour, if not more, and am not always good at stopping and breathing. Usually my solution to growth is to go faster, go harder, go deeper, like go, go, go. And actually, I think COVID has enforced a different level of reflection and pausing often, not just pausing, getting slammed and stopped and braked in different ways. So this whole business of stopping and checking in and breathing has been part of the growth, and where I need to do that times 10, times 1,000. So if I really check in, how has this been a growth moment? The podcast, but really, I was going to say this has been my year of expansion, but it's been a longer than a year because you and I are recording this in October of 21, and the expansion started literally the day everything shut down. And so I've grown more in that time, I think, than for my business as a coach. I've grown more in this chunk than I probably had in the last 15 years. So it's been accelerated growth, hyper growth. And so the podcast is, to me, inextricably intertwined or tied up with the other parts of expansion and growth in my coaching practice, in my life. So I don't know if I can, separate the podcast out from the bigger picture.
I love what you're saying, and I love that you're looking at it as a whole. And I concur. I have seen you grow and expand as a coach and a businesswoman in ways that were previously unfathomable to me for you. And every step of the way, I think I've just been honestly rather stunned because you've gone out of comfort zones and even out of the familiar. You've moved from the known to the unknown, and you just keep going. Every time you have hit a block or an obstacle, I've seen you dig in, go deep, do the work,
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm walking my talk again more now than
really walk
ever.
your talk, honestly. If you don't mind, let's move into that a little bit because we can always come back to defining how the podcast has been part of the growth moment. And maybe through this episode, there'll be some more clarity and some kind of lessons learned. But for right now, where have you had to walk your talk in this year of expansion? Where are the classic Amy Kay tools been useful for you? And where have you had to self coach?
A zillion times every day, every week. So one, it's not like, oh, there's one little moment where I needed to refine or dial up something or dial down something in a week. It is like this explosion or this intensity. So the growth has been just intense. So there has been self-coaching constant, like, and now as I'm saying it, no wonder I'm so freaking exhausted a lot of the time. And I hadn't put my finger on it till right this moment of because it's like, if you get growing pains when you're in adolescence or whatever stages, like I've been in one long growth spurt for this year and a half plus, and there are loads of growing pains, and no wonder. It's not just the workload or the number of hours or the time on the weekend. I think it's the growth itself. So that's a cool insight for me and doesn't necessarily make it easier, but it almost provides some, oh, right. Okay, duh, that you sometimes can't see when you're in the midst of it.
Well, I think understanding what's going on inside is always a bit of a relief, really.
Yeah, and that's why that acknowledgement tool, the seeing where you are, that's a self-coaching tool of where are you now? What is that like? And I don't do enough of that. I do it, I have my coach every other week, the great and powerful Oz, who is Andrew Petty, and who I wouldn't be here. So actually, I think about that. So it's not just the self coaching. I hadn't had a coach for years. I mean, I would get coaching here and there, but I hadn't had a steady coach until last year. And it is not a coincidence that as soon as I started coaching with Andrew, he's the one who gave the name of the year. He goes, "You're in your year of expansion." Like, yeah. And that has been a fundamental component of the coach really needed a coach in order to grow, of course, naturally. So it's a combination of the self coaching and his coaching and a lot of other incredible people who I've been growing with this past time. So that's one piece of walking my talk. I can't be a great coach unless I have a great coach, period. Another piece of walking my talk is the courage to push into the growth zone, to get out of the comfort zone. So I started coaching 2002. Almost from the get go, I had a pretty nice little practice going because I had a lot of contacts and network from my startup and corporate days to lean into when I first got started, and a lot of people who were amazing and come and say, "Yeah, I want you to coach me." Honestly, my practice has always been kind of easy. And maybe not easy for someone else, but I had it dialed in, 15 to 20 hours a week, and I saw clients Tuesdays through Thursdays. Mondays were my marketing day, and Friday was my day off. And I had time for lunch and I had time to do the laundry. It was sweet. And I was very happy and incredibly comfy. And I would do different things within those years. I wrote a book called Becoming a Mother Without Losing Yourself with the fabulous coach and co-author Joelle J. And there were some things that I did around that. But none of my forays out of the base one-on-one coaching ever really went anywhere. They all sounded good, but it didn't gain traction, didn't didn't take me anywhere. So I was like, oh yeah, I'll just stay in this nice comfy area, and I've got my practice and all is well. And then COVID hit. And with that, my very first response after the initial, like, what the hell is going on, was, oh, I've got to do 100 gift sessions because I need to go help the world. That is my COVID response. And it was honest and pure and unselfish. And I wasn't thinking that, oh, this is a really smart thing to do for marketing. I just thought about it, and 15 minutes later sent out an email to all my clients and posted it on social media and said, okay, anybody who wants one can have, the first 100 people to say yes, please. And so what that did was it threw open the doors, and I was coaching on every weekday, and I was coaching at night, and my inbox was deluged. And I remember there was one day where it's like, okay, 30 people in an hour said yes, please. I'm like, oh my God, what have I done? At that point, I had maybe done video coaching half a dozen times for some clients who really pushed, because I had always only done the phone all those years. And all of a sudden, I'm doing just a boatload of Zoom coaching, and I'm seeing faces, and I'm seeing faces in Europe, and I'm seeing faces even in Cairo, Egypt, and I'm seeing faces across Canada and the US. And I've always had a pretty far flung practice, but this was different because it was old faces, new faces, 20 somethings who normally maybe wouldn't have budgeted for a coach or afford, it wouldn't have fit. People in their 70s, people in their 80s, everything in between. And it opened my heart, it opened my mind. It got rid of the limiting. So here's a walk your talk. It got rid of the limiting belief of, well, I just work half time. I can't, I'm older now. I can't work full out. I don't have the capacity or the energy anymore. That was just the old Amy in startup, high tech computer internet days. That girl's gone. And instead, I was like, oh, that girl's still here. She just needed the right impetus and the right calling to step out of the comfort zone. So, I mean, I have like a ton more thoughts, but I want to almost go, what are you hearing from that initial? It was like a watershed moment, and there's no going back to pre 100 gift sessions. I could never go back.
Yeah, that's so huge. And just hearing you talk about it again, what I'm hearing and feeling and remembering is this colossal sense in you of being alive and of and on purpose. Like you were being used up, but used up in the best ways. And you've always said, let me just coach. That's all I want to do. I just want to coach, everything that it takes to kind of run a business and set things
Because
up.
I'm
And
good at all
in,
that other stuff. I ran businesses for years. Like that's a skill, of running the whole show and doing all that other stuff. But that's not where I feel alive. That's not, yeah, I feel competent, but yeah, it's that much coaching was electrifying.
and it was, I mean, I have to say, you were on fire and happy and vibrant
And
and
tired, exhausted at the end of the night, but like that, I left it all on the field thing.
right. I mean, and I just wanted to make a point is, all those years of being really good at what you were doing, but instead of being on purpose, and I don't know if this is a difference, but being on purpose versus being driven, like I think being driven is kind of different.
So there's driven to prove,
Mm-hmm.
and that there's always a piece of that in me for sure. Of needing to, am I good enough? Can I be good enough? I should be better. So, there as much work as I've done on the inner critic, and that's been a huge walk your talk over and over. And I can speak more to that later, maybe. But So there's driven to prove, to excel, but this driven to serve, to not hold back, to go, because I still feel it a year and a half later. I want to coach as many people as possible. So now if I tie back to the podcast, so did the 100 and then kind of went into depression for a couple of weeks after it was over. Honestly, I think that was like early summer of 20. And we're just like, oh my God, what did I just do? And then here's the other piece that then fell into place is my husband had a big job shift. And so my practice all of a sudden and what I'm earning for a moment became just more important, like and I had this calling, not just to coach, but I remember writing it down. I want to powerfully provide for my family. I don't want to just do good in the world and earn good money as a coach. I want to provide for my family. So all of a sudden that I want to coach everyone, then this other piece kind of came along and clicked in. I want to powerfully provide. And then, of course, my son started high school, the fall of 20.
But there was this convergence of life circumstance.
Yeah, exactly. Where a lot of pieces came together, an impetus, a calling, hitting a different stage with my boy so that he still needs me a ton, but in a different way. We're all at home. So there's that, even though I was always at home in the home office.
But not everybody else was with you.
No, definitely not. So this convergence of all the pieces where pretty quickly by the summer of 20, I was like, oh, it wasn't just that 100 thing. And that's when I met Andrew and I hired him. And then things really, it's like, oh, I'm still growing. And so to touch on that, that's when the podcast started, is it took all of the rest of 20 for me to dream it up, conceive it, birth it. It took more than 6 months. And so then these other incredible growth partners. So I met Tim and Val of Podcast Performance Coaching because Andrew had this kick-ass podcast called Andrew Petty is Dying. And it was so amazing. Like, how the heck did you do that? And he goes, oh, well, I hired podcast coaches. Well, that's the best idea I've ever heard. If it wasn't for them, I never, ever, I would have had a great idea. Oh, I should do a podcast, because one day of me trying to figure it out was enough to go, oh, I don't ever want to do this. So I hired them. I'm really good at hiring people to help me. I hired them, and it took over the 6-month program I signed up for, because they took me through. It wasn't just okay, here's where you record and then you put this up. It was, why do you want one? Who's your target audience? The big why, the big what, the vision, the what do you want out of it? If it was everything you wanted to be, what would happen? So I took a good 3 months to just get through those questions. And it was all part of the expansion. It was much bigger than just the podcast. It caused me to, after all these years as a coach, to say, well, what do I want now? What if I'm not done? What if I'm not on cruise control? What if I'm just getting started? 20 years in, holy cow. The funny thing is I didn't tell anybody, even you, for months that I was working on a podcast.
No, you didn't.
I didn't tell my husband. I didn't tell my son.
Which was probably an awesome strategy.
Because usually I do tell people stuff, and this was so precious to me. It wasn't not wanting to jinx it. I wanted to keep it close. I wanted to, again, it was kind of very precious. And so that I wouldn't have something like, I'm going to do this and then not do it. So ironically, because a coaching tool is always tell somebody, be accountable to someone, but I was being accountable to Tim and Val. So
right.
There was deep accountability, but Andrew was the only one who knew I was working on it.
Can I have you pause? I just want to go back to something that you said, because we actually have never talked about this, I don't think, is there, I don't know, when you just said you didn't want to tell anybody because it felt so precious. Can you just take a pause and go into that feeling?
Oh God, I'm going to get teary.
Go into that for me.
I think the podcast is precious because it had been a long time that I had tried to do something bigger. So, way back, as you know well, when I did the book, it's a beautiful book, it's a great book, but it didn't go anywhere. And I put a lot of Amy and effort. And so did my co author, Joelle, who went on to write many successful solo books as a leadership coach. And so that was a very vulnerable, tender place that I put deep, deep inside. Said,
Mm.
let's just shut that
Hmm.
away. Because I looked at it not as a growth moment. I didn't use my tools. I looked at it as a failure, and that let's not ever try to do something bigger. And so people would say, oh, you wrote a book. That's so great. And I'd be like, oh, yes, yes, I'm an author. But I knew inside that I wasn't a real author. I wasn't a real anything. And that, yeah, and that I had to kind of keep that failure quiet and hidden and secret. By doing the podcast, it was willing to be vulnerable again, to risk failure. Mm-hmm.
That's really big, Amy.
And even expanding the practice. So this expansion is the expansion. I mean, my clientele has more than doubled, more than, I haven't counted it, but my community of quote clients, I don't look at them as clients. I look at as people in my circle, that I'm there for you, whether we're coaching or not, has drastically expanded. My revenue absolutely is expanded. My reach, through the podcast, et cetera, has expanded. And then, so I think this is where I want to tie in the group coaching. So, it's last summer, I'm working on the podcast. And then October comes closer. And I had a client in Paris at the time who said, God, I'm feeling so isolated. It would be so great if you had a group I could join, some group coaching. And because, I don't want to do one-on-one right now. I don't have it in my budget. It would be something. And in this more expansive mode, I was like, sure, I can start a group. Why not? I've never done group coaching my whole life, but why not? And, send out an email 5 minutes later. Who wants to be in a group with me? And of course, with that large of a circle, within a week or two, I had a whole whack of people in my first group and I made it up on the fly. All right, we're going to do this. And it was all instinctive. It was not logical. None of this was, I think I want to expand my business model to include group coaching and it'll bring in this much money. Like just impulse and intuition, calling. And it was so awesome. There was lots of things in those early days that I tweaked and fixed. It's like, oh, I had too many people at first. People didn't get their turn. How are we doing the Zoom? Just all kinds of stuff. But the core of it was, oh, this is genius. Because for me, it wasn't bringing in a lesson to teach anybody. It's not a workshop. The group coaching that I do, it's like one giant coaching session and we're all in there, but I'm coaching one-on-one and then we're all reflecting and weaving in the insights to everybody. And then I coach somebody else and I never know how it's going to go. And it's always just live and organic and phenomenal. And there are 20 somethings to 80 somethings. There's ages and stages and mothers and not mothers. It's all women so far. I really want to do a men's group, but I just haven't figured that out yet. But now, a year later, I have 3 to 4 groups every month. It's a format that I now do group coaching within corporations, for special groups. I did a group that was over in Eastern Europe with all kinds of male and female entrepreneurs. It's this new, I don't know, this like new entity that has like I use everywhere now. And I can't imagine not having group coaching. So it's still the one-on-one thing that I feed off of because I have to have me to you moment. But that's how I look at the podcast is I'm still coaching you. So I'm coaching when I'm doing the guests, I'm coaching the guests, but the whole time I can feel every single other person that I'm one-on-one coaching. So when I do those pieces in between the coaching where I'm like, okay, here's what there is for you, that's not coming from logic. That's not coming from, oh, I should say this. It's kind of channeling out of me, is this is what I'm supposed to say to everybody right now. So it's still to me one-on-one. And somebody asked like, oh, don't you want a TED Talk? I'm like, yeah, no, I don't want a TED Talk because I wouldn't be coaching anybody. But I would want to be at a TED conference and then sit in some other room with 2 chairs and anyone can come sit next to me and I'll coach them for 10 minutes. Like I do that. This coachathon thing that I love that I'm just playing with in some organizations where I coach one after another to see what's coming up in this company or this organization or this community or the world. Like I could do that every day, all day long and never get tired. But as soon as I'm more lecturing or teaching, I'm good at that, really good. I'm really good at speaking, but it ends up not draining me, but it does not have the same fire as when I'm coaching. Wow, that was fun for me. This reflection on my own growth moment with my most excellent interviewer, Jan, continues in part 2. Look for that second half, not in the next episode, but the one following. What an amazing reminder as a coach of how necessary reflection is to the growth process. Jan gave me the grace and space to look over the last year and a half and really get how much learning, momentum, and change has taken place. And not just taken place passively, change that I have created and generated. There has been so much walking my talk during this time. What sticks out the most for me is my willingness to push out of my comfort zone into the wild, wonderful, challenging growth zone, and how I have needed all kinds of partners in that process. I absolutely cannot do it alone. Please do tune into part 2 to hear the rest of my growth story. I thank you for being part of my journey and purpose. I challenge you today to move out of your comfort zone. It's such an honor to be your coach. I want you to feel my support and the open invitation to partner in whatever way you need, from one-on-one coaching to a group or a workshop, or continuing to listen to me here. Remember, you can find all the episodes on thegrowthmoment.com and by subscribing and following on your favorite podcast app. Now get out there and grow today.